Evangelicalism was my life. I was a Christian. It was my entire identity. It was my entire life. It was my purpose. It was everything to me. And I thought that when I left the community and separated myself from the sexual shaming that I had experienced, that I would now suddenly be free, that I would no longer struggle with sexual shame and fear and anxiety. And much to the contrary, what actually happened is that those things did not go away.
And it can't be just about a handful of individuals. It has to be about all of us talking back about what we went through, and that's the only way that we're going to be heard and get representation.
If you're raised in a culture where the Christian popular culture, which is the only popular culture that's approved for you to enjoy, is pushing the idea that the end is coming, that Christians are going to be persecuted, and you have to be ready to be a martyr, you're raised to be a culture warrior.
CBS presents Deconstructing My Religion.
At the age of 13, while attending church with her mother, Linda K. Klein became a born-again Christian.
I actually went to a large-scale altar call and for the first time heard a large group talking about Jesus and talking about faith the way that my mom had always talked about it. And it felt alive and hopeful and like home in many ways.
As a newly minted young evangelical Christian, religious life became all-consuming.
The rules of evangelicalism are generally, are you born again? And do you use that language? Is that something that is an important experience in your life? And do you feel that that born again experience means that you are now obligated to help others become born again because that's the one route to becoming a saved Christian and going to heaven?
Klein sang and played guitar in the church praise band. She led a Bible study at her public junior high school, and she went on mission trips. As an evangelical, she was also expected to maintain her sexual purity until she was married.
A lot of my personal energy toward wanting to prove that I was a good Christian went inward to trying to control my inner life, make sure that I was utterly free of sexual thought, free of sexual feelings, certainly not inspiring sexual thoughts and feelings in others.
Sex outside of heterosexual marriage in evangelical culture is considered a sin. In the 1990s, an entire industry was created to support this message, and it continues today. Girls wear purity rings as a reminder to stay chaste.
I think the product that actually exemplifies it the most is purity-themed Bibles. So when you actually have a Bible that is themed around purity, one of them having 60 pages of non-biblical material that's entirely dedicated to the importance of purity, with messages like avoid the horizontal.
Boys are also taught the importance of abstinence.
Boys are also held to a strict gender expectation, and one of the aspects of the gender expectation is they are expected to be tempted by the female flesh. The difference is that a boy can mess up, whereas a girl is messed up if she has any sexual expression.
Maintaining one's purity is often laden with shame and anxiety. It is also confusing.
You could potentially be losing your purity as a 14-year-old having a close male friend, whereas somebody else might say, okay, you'll lose your purity somewhere between holding hands and having sex. We're not exactly going to tell you where, but it's within that spectrum, and wherever you go, it's a slippery slope to the other end. So you lived in a constant state of anxiety, wondering when someone would deem your purity as lost, because you don't get to decide when your purity is lost. Other people get to decide when your purity is lost. It's determined by the community.
The issue of consent is never discussed.
The notion is we don't have to talk about consent because if you are a good, pure girl, then ultimately we won't have sexual expression of any kind. You're going to do everything just right, so nobody will have any sexual thoughts, any sexual feelings, or take any sexual actions. And if all of the girls and women would just do that, then we don't have to even talk about consent.
Klein spent her senior year of high school in Australia. As she considered her future, something in her began to shift.
Up until that point, I was going to go to Bible college because that's what a good Christian did. I was going to become a missionary because that's what a good Christian woman did. My only two options as a good Christian woman who wanted to dedicate her life to the faith was to become a children's minister or a youth minister, somebody who worked with young people because you couldn't work with adults as a woman, or you got to become a missionary.
While looking at other colleges, a brochure from the liberal arts school, Sarah Lawrence, caught her attention.
I'd never heard of Sarah Lawrence before, but they sent me a brochure and the cover said, "You are different," and the inside said, "So are we." And I was like, yes.
As a freshman at Sarah Lawrence, surrounded by people who did not share her worldview, Klein reckoned with her shame.
I really started to recognize at that point my sexual shame and fear and anxiety as problematic, and no longer saw those as healthy, holy things, but saw those as unhealthy, damaging, dangerous things.
While not all women raised in the evangelical movement find purity culture problematic, Klein found the culture toxic. Even after she left, she felt intense shame when it came to sex.
This manifested for me most poignantly when I was in my early 20s and I was with a boyfriend who I really loved, and I was ready to express my love for him in a physical way. And yet every time we got even close to having sex, I would break down into tears. I would end up I have eczema, and my eczema comes out when I get stressed, so my eczema would be coming out and I'd be scratching myself until I bled, and I would end up in a ball in the corner of the bed.
It was only after she began talking to the evangelical women she grew up with that she began to understand.
Up until that point, maybe I could have believed what I'd been taught as a young person, which was, Linda, you're experiencing shame because you're shameful. You're experiencing anxiety because you ought to be. You're doing something bad. You know, you're even getting close to having sex is bad enough that, you know, this is punishment. But my girlfriends back home in the church had made completely different life choices. Some of them were still virgins. Some of them had gotten married and not even had their first kiss until they were at the altar. Some were having sex outside of marriage. Some were, you know, had sex before getting married. All of these different life decisions. And yet these incredibly similar stories about sexual fear and shame and anxiety that for many of us was manifesting in our bodies in ways that mimicked classic PTSD.
Klein began collecting the stories of her friends from home and beyond.
And not just collecting stories, but telling my stories, so doing this story exchange, which became the catalyst for 12 years of doing this with people who were raised in white evangelical churches like ours around the country. You know, that's what was the road to healing. That's what really allowed me to start to differentiate what I had been taught from what I was.
Klein recently published a book titled Pure, with Touchstone, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, a division of CBS. While Klein is no longer an evangelical, she still calls herself a Christian.
For a long time, I thought that I wasn't allowed to use the label because I had been raised to believe that there was only one true Christianity and that every other Christian was a fake. Our lives are telling us that the story that we were given as a child, that we believed, is a fiction. More and more people are coming into voice, and I think that's because, first of all, we know that that's the only way you create change, and second of all, because this really is the way to healing.
Coming up.
People that you meet from outside evangelical subculture, if you get out of it, have no idea what you're talking about.
If you were so hurt by someone in a religious environment that you cannot even engage with the idea of God, then that's totally understandable. And you have to pursue the thing that makes you whole.
But you don't have to throw out all of Christianity if you don't want to. I want nothing to do with organized religion now.
Some of them still
Blake
are.
Chastain and Christopher Stroop were both raised in conservative evangelical households in the Midwest.
I think when the public thinks of evangelicals, maybe they think a little bit about Ned Flanders, like, oh, they're quirky, they're kind of weird, but they're fine. They can participate in good faith in American democracy. They don't think about the devastating psychological impact that it has on many people to be raised as children with fear of hell, fear of being left behind in the rapture, so much pressure to try to convert other people to your faith, purity culture, what all of that has on people has long-term devastating psychological effects on many of us who grew up really in the thick of it and mobilized for the culture wars, trained up to be soldiers for Christ.
Stroop attended a conservative Christian school where his mother was also a teacher.
I took AP Biology in high school. Our AP Biology teacher was an absolute trip, a kind of apocalyptic mystic. He would often start his classes with what he called a thought, which was like a devotional, but they would be about, the end times. He would predict that the rapture was probably going to happen this year around Yom Kippur.
The end times is a belief held by some Christians that the world is approaching an apocalyptic end. Some children raised in this conservative evangelical subculture have vivid memories of watching the 1970s film about the rapture in A Thief in the Night.
One of these days, and it could be any minute now, Christ is going to come back for his own. After that, it's going to be pretty awful here on earth.
Kids who watch these movies when they're like 5 years old and are told that this is real, this is the future, it's going to happen very soon, freak out. And so we saw people say, oh, I thought I was the only one who was traumatized by that movie. Or I thought I was the only one who, when I woke up and I couldn't find my parents around, I was afraid that they'd been raptured and I'd been left behind.
Chastain was drawn to religion from an early age. He worked in a Christian bookstore and attended a Christian college. He felt a calling to ministry.
My first full week of freshman year of college was 9/11, and that sort of shifted my experience. I was a history major, and there was a teacher there, the main professor, taught a lot about the biblical worldview, and that sort of push towards this sort of militant Christianity, and there was widespread support for, the push to war in Iraq. And I was also becoming increasingly pacifist in my convictions, and so that sort of led to this major crisis of faith.
Overwhelmed by doubt, he didn't know what to believe anymore.
A very common term that a lot of people use to describe this feeling of being unmoored is deconstruction. Specifically in the context of faith, that means taking the things that you were taught and determining, that you don't agree with those teachings and finding your own sort of way in order to make sense of it and reconcile it with your own experience as well.
When I was starting to have my crisis of faith at about the age of 16, when I read through the entire Bible for the first time and I couldn't reconcile certain things, certain contradictions didn't seem to make sense.
Stroop went to his pastor with his doubts. The pastor was sympathetic at first.
I still didn't feel like all my questions had been resolved, so I went back and talked to him again, and suddenly the problem was with me. Now this is the language he used. I must be harboring sin in my life, because otherwise I would be able to read the Bible through the Holy Spirit and see that it is perfect and inerrant. And so I was really afraid that maybe he was right.
If you feel uncertain about a particular teaching, if you feel uncertain about a particular practice, and you begin to sort of question that or examine it, it can be extremely hard to find someone that is safe to be vulnerable, to tell them about that. And that, because faith is supposed to be so certain. People, when they are open about their doubts, they open themselves up to be hurt or to be sometimes punished.
You are taught to doubt your own doubts, basically to gaslight yourself. There's all these internalized disciplinary mechanisms that keep you in the fold, because any thought that comes from you, if it contradicts this interpretation of Scripture that you're taught, could be from the devil.
The insularity of the movement makes it difficult to break free.
That term, the world, is something that one encounters commonly in evangelicalism and fundamentalist Christianity as a kind of dark and scary place. Secular institutions, secular society, you're supposed to go out into it and try to convert people, but it could also be a threat to your soul. So they build this whole parallel structure where you can basically live your entire life inside of it.
You can live an entirely cloistered life in consuming only evangelical content, whether that's music or movies. You can go to only Christian schools, only Christian colleges, work for only Christian employers, have all of your social circle be filled to the brim with just Christians of a certain kind too.
Chastain is no longer at Evangelical, but he now attends an Episcopalian church.
I also find certain Buddhist practices very empowering and addressing things like my anxiety, and sort of the compassion that it teaches you. I'm also like pluralist and universalist. I don't believe in hell anymore. I'm probably agnostic to some degree because I can't say anything for certain.
Stroop broke free after attending a secular college and getting a PhD in Russian history from Stanford. He is no longer religious.
I can still see that there are good, healthy ways of being religious, and it's not my place to try to pull people out of that if that's what's helping them escape their toxic background.
Coming up.
The evangelicals have been unbelievable to Donald Trump.
"81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in the 2016 election.
The evangelicals have been unbelievable to Donald Trump. They have been unbelievable. Boy, do they understand me. They understand me better than anybody.
2 years in, a PRRI poll reveals 68% of white evangelicals view the president favorably. They are the only religious group that supports this presidency.
I think one of the things that I've seen in our community is people sort of reckoning, even if they left a long time ago, even if they left evangelicalism a long time ago, they were shocked and in a lot of ways hurt again by feeling like they were betrayed by a group of people and a society that helped form their moral ethic in a very, very profound way.
Blake Chastain grew up a conservative evangelical, but left the community in his 20s.
To see them sacrifice all of that supposed moralism for such a blatant power grab is devastating. And it made me very, very angry. It made me angry because, here I am trying to piece things together one way or another and trying to understand both my background and where I'm going from here.
Before the election, finding like-minded souls who grew up in an insular religious community was difficult.
People are often so isolated because evangelical subculture does not create a space to process it. People that you meet from outside evangelical subculture, if you get out of it, have no idea what you're talking about. So yeah, it's very important to find others like you and know that you're not alone.
Social media in the Trump era has changed all of that.
We actually met over Twitter.
I've made a lot of good connections through Twitter.
Chastain popularized the term exvangelical on Twitter and created a podcast by the same name.
Hello and welcome to Exvangelical.
It gets up to 13,000 downloads a month.
I don't care what you believe now. What I care about is that you're whole, that you emphasize wholeness over holiness. And that is something that I think that can be difficult for some outsiders to understand about our community, is that it's not dogmatic.
For Stroop, it was the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August 2017 that brought his online activism to a new level.
Oh my God, a car just ran through the crowd and backed up.
The day after the rally, the president claimed there were fine people on both sides.
I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either.
I immediately went to look at certain evangelical leaders on Twitter and just in the media in general to see what they were saying or weren't saying about this.
The media has painted, the liberals have painted a false narrative that the president is a racist, and anytime he tries to break out of that box, liberals aren't going to allow him to do it.
Robert Jeffress, pretty soon after that, went on TV and said Trump doesn't have a racist bone in his body. So, I was riffing on Twitter about how frustrating this is. That evangelicals never listen to criticism from anyone. And, they're so complicit in this, but there's no way to hold them accountable. One thing that they are threatened by is the possibility of declining church numbers and losing the youth.
In response, Stroop created the Twitter hashtag, #EmptyThePews.
I created Empty the Pews as a rallying cry, and I initially asked people to share stories of how they had left evangelicalism, specifically in connection with Trump and Trumpism.
The hashtag went viral. Today, there is a private Facebook group with nearly 3,500 members. At the center of the discussion are women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ community.
And it also is a place where people say, did anybody else ever go through this thing? Or people can discuss abuse, really dark things with people who can understand it, be sympathetic.
Evangelicalism itself is not a monolith, and so everybody has different experiences of how they grew up in it.
Emily Joy calls herself an ex-evangelical.
I will say that the way that I experienced it and the way that a significant chunk of people experienced it was one where everything about life, from spirituality to friendships to sexuality to just anything you can think of, was just all of it rooted in so much shame.
If I had a crush on someone or discovered that someone had feelings for me, I would instantly remind myself of how dirty and depraved I was.
We've been saying there's a problem for years, and nobody believed us. And we were like, no, this is a problem. This religion that we grew up in, it's very racist, it's very sexist, it's very homophobic, like trying to wave the flags. And they were like, no, you're just like bitter, angry millennials that hate God and want to destroy the church. And I was like, okay, well, look what happened.
While not everyone who grew up as an evangelical shares these views, voices critical of the movement deserve to be heard, according to religious studies professor Julie Ingersoll.
The folks who have organized it on social media and seem to be leaders are very specific that they are not all in the same place either.
Ingersoll is a professor at the University of North Florida. She studies the issues that give rise to an ex-evangelical subculture.
All they share is that they have a criticism of this movement that they understand as evangelicalism. So they've left over lots of different kinds of reasons, but many of those reasons come down to issues associated with gender and sexuality, concerns over women's equality, but also concerns over LGBT rights.
What they are saying matters, especially at this critical point in our nation's history.
This conservative Protestantism that we're calling evangelicalism is on the political ascendancy right now. These conservative Protestants are in lots of power. And there are strains of the version of evangelicalism to which they adhere that are problematic for democracy. And these ex-evangelicals are calling our attention to those dimensions. They're pointing us to the authoritarian threads in this tradition. They're pointing us to the ways in which this tradition has privileged whiteness. They're calling our attention to the way in which this tradition privileges masculinity over femininity. And I think that's important for us to recognize.
Stroop and Chastain emphasize that they are a leaderless movement.
It can't be just about a handful of individuals. It has to be about all of us talking back about what we went through, and that's the only way that we're going to be heard and get representation.
Right.
In September, a small group of ex-evangelicals gathered in Clearwater, Florida.
I'm not a member of the LGBT plus community myself, but it was the treatment of that group that really hastened my exodus from this subculture.
When I start getting involved in a Southern Baptist church, it doesn't take me long to understand that women have a place in the church, but it's second place. It's always going to be second place. And the first thing you have to be able to put away is your intelligence. You have to put away your intellect. You have to be able to laugh at whatever some man says and be able to accept that he is always going to rule over you, that his opinion matters and yours doesn't if it disagrees with his.
There was also a meetup in Chicago.
Here's a thing that I wrote. I was homeschooled with the fundamentalist Christian curriculum, so in addition to a science education tantamount to God did it, so shut up, and a highly delayed understanding of what sarcasm is, I came of age with a very limited understanding of sex.
They're one of the few places where we find a sustained critique of this movement by people who really know this movement. You know, sometimes people who disagree with them want to write them off as not really Christian, but they're really good at articulating how it is that that's not a reasonable criticism. They know everything there is to know about this culture. This was their identity. They were raised in it, and they left it with a lot of pain for the most part.
Evangelicals, you know, we're talking back now. We need to be considered stakeholders in conversations on American evangelicalism, because otherwise you get this absolutely distorted picture. All of this, you know, we hope is just going to make it easier for other people to leave and find supportive community. And a lot of that is online right now, but the more that this gets out there and the more people start to identify with it, then the more kind of in-person events and local communities we can create. And so we're starting to do some of that.
To view this program and others like it, go to cbsnews.com/religion and culture.